Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm John Laughland, the director of Forum for Democracy International. My co-host Peter Lavelle and I are delighted to welcome as our main guest this week, Hauke Ritz, who joins us from Berlin, and George Samueli, who joins us from Budapest. Hauke Ritz and we met, I believe, about 15 years ago, and we have a number of friends in common. And then our paths have subsequently crossed after you got back in touch with me and sent me the original German and the Italian version of your book, the Italian version having come out this January. The German version came out in 2024. And, the world is small, isn't it? Particularly at the top, because I see that you're published in Italy by Thomas Fazzi, the Italian commentator who we've had on the forum ourselves many times. And the two titles of your book, in German and Italian, are very interesting. The German title, as befits a German title, is much more, let's say, cumbersome and heavy and substantial. The Italian one is much more direct. The German title is From the Decline of the West to the Rediscovery of Europe, Vom Niedergang des Westens zur Neuerfindung Europas. And the Italian title is much more direct, Perché l'Occidente odia la Russia, Why the West Hates Russia. And in reading your book, Hauke Ritz, I had a strange sensation, because you and I, without having been in touch very much over these last years, have clearly been on exactly the same path. All the books that you mention in your book, they're the ones that I mention in my lectures. I've seen some of your videos. You even make a point that I make in my lectures about the European Union when you talk about the euro banknotes having fictitious monuments on them. So I feel a very strong community of spirit. And in particular, I feel a community of spirit because in your book you outline the history of American geopolitics for the last 30 years, a story which personally I know very well, and which maybe other people know as well. But you conclude your book with a much more philosophical diagnosis of why the West hates Russia. And perhaps we could start by you going to the conclusion. Perhaps you could give us your philosophical explanation. We all know about the neocons, we know about the Cold War, we know about the unipolar moment, we know about the full spectrum dominance, we know about Paul Wolfowitz and so on. But you give, and this I think is where your book really its greatest strength, you give a very interesting philosophical analysis of why the West hates Russia and why the hatred of Russia is linked to other things about Western civilization. Hauke Ritz.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I very well remember our meeting 15 years ago. Yeah, I was a little bit unsatisfied when I wrote the book about the traditional answers to the conflict. Usually people refer to geography and Mackinder and the heartland, or they speak about resources. And of course, there's some truth to it. It's not completely wrong. But I thought all the time there must be something else, because you just don't accumulate power just for accumulation of power. You want to do something with it. And so with this question in mind, I started to look at the history of the Cold War. And I discovered, as somebody who lives in Berlin, where East and West are combined, and the wall is mentally still standing even 30 years, more than 30 years after. So I came across that East Germans are so much different than West Germans, and the divide that between East Germans and West Germans is now much stronger than, for example, the old divide between Bavarians and Northern Germans. Yeah. And so there must something have happened during the Cold War. And so I came across the fact that there was a cultural dimension to the Cold War, and that from this cultural dimension, of the Cold War was maybe the most important dimension. We still remember the Cold War with these spy stories, James Bond, and nuclear weapons and arms race. This was, of course, not irrelevant, but in the end, the Berlin Wall came down not because of that, but because of pop music, of jeans, of an image of lifestyle that was created during the Cold War on the Western side. And One of the other things that haunts me for decades is the divide we see between the traditional European culture, which is manifested in our classical music and literature, which has a lot of example of very impressive personalities, of a deep understanding what it means to be a human, and the picture of humanity that is portrayed in pop music and Hollywood movies, and this antagonism between those two is fundamentally big. So I cannot really understand how the one emerged from the other, and so this again put my attention in the direction that has something happened during the Cold War, and yeah, maybe I leave it there, and we.
Well, one of the many occasions when I came across references in your bibliography and in your footnotes to books that I myself have read with great interest and benefit is your references to Francis Stoner Saunders' book on the cultural Cold War, which is a masterpiece, really, even though I sometimes say it's a masterpiece without the author necessarily having intended it to be the masterpiece that it is. I mean by that she, in a sense, wishes to taint the CIA for its cultural Cold War. She says, well, if the CIA did it, it must have been bad, which is fair enough. But what she, being a leftist herself, what she perhaps doesn't understand is the cultural Cold War, which was waged, as you've suggested in your answer to me just now, Hauke Ritz, was waged, as it were, from the left, from the progressive side, the West seeking to present itself as more progressive, more materially and morally progressive than the Soviet bloc, ended up, in fact, becoming left itself. The big Western organizations, the CIA, MI6, and so on, they are now, it seems to me, and have been for many decades, profoundly progressivist. And Russophobia, in that sense, to me, is a symptom of progressivism, and has been, in fact, since the 18th century. Progressives in Europe hate Russia because they think of Russia
it looks
as
like you and I are the only one live. Okay.
Yeah, but you're referring to what Francis Stoner Saunders described as the creation of a non-communistic left. So you put aside the contradiction of capital and labor and imperialism and sovereignty, and instead you push all the other antagonism between man and woman, environment issue, environment, civilization, majority, minority, modernity and old traditions, and you create in this way a kind of fake left, or a left that has lost its core element.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, it's true that we have now seen during the Cold War, and especially after the Cold War, the emergence of a new ideology which uses a lot of issues and topics of left discussions, which were discussed in left circles for hundreds and more years. But they are, to some extent, cut off from the main issue of the left, meaning the strive for a just society. And so, as somebody who's myself coming from the left, I've studied in the FU, in the Free University of Berlin, at chairs of professors who had a Marxist background, were scholars of Adorno and others important figures of the left scene in the midst of the 20th century. And for me, these progressive, so-called progressive forces, I saw them as a kind of fake left. And this fake left has now become the official ideology of the Western world. And indeed, Russia represents the original version of European culture that has not dramatically altered during the Cold War, which just stayed its course, has still connection to the 19th century, still remember the literature, the music of that time, and has an original understanding of humanism and of the good side of enlightenment, and rationality, science, philosophy, and the western part of Europe has lost a large amount of it. And I also would like to put the emphasis on the fact that there are differences between the United States as a civilization and Europe as a civilization. And the task the CIA was confronted with at the beginning of the Cold War was that even the conservative parties in Europe had a social agenda. The social system introduced after the Second World War in Germany, Italy, and France was introduced by conservative parties. So from the American viewpoint, even the conservatives in Europe were socialist. And not to speak from the real socialists and the unions and so forth. And the fear of the United States was that the Soviet Union could use this to create channels to West European countries, to the elites.
It did have them. It had them. It had them in the immediate post-war period, undoubtedly.
Yeah. So the task was to push Europe, which had a political system that was the republics in Europe were always moving between a conservative political understanding and a social political understanding, and liberalism didn't play a large part in Europe. Maybe in England a little bit more, but in continental Europe, liberal parties only get 10% in or even less in elections. So the task was to remodel the European culture, the political culture in Europe in a way that it becomes liberal, like in the United States. In the United States, we have always liberalism at power. Sometimes it's the Republican version, sometimes it's a Democratic version, but they all are for free market, for laissez-faire, for individualism, for the right of the very rich, the oligarchy, and this was not in the same. This was different in Europe, and this transformation of political culture in Europe to transform Europe into kind of liberal copy of the United States. This was a very heartful process, and
I mean, it's good with Russophobia. I mean, given your argument, which I think is very compelling, is that Russophobia is the result of a large group of people embracing traditional culture and values. Is that the origins of Russophobia in Europe?
I
lived in Poland for 10 years, and now I've lived in Russia for 27 years. And one thing that I've noticed, and I was a student of communism, okay? Mm-hmm. George and I studied communist regimes of Eastern Europe before they all went away. Mm-hmm. And one of the phenomenon that I think is most compelling, it's not ideological, it's not Marxist-Leninism, is that in Poland, what did communism eventually do? It made everyone into a cultural conservative bourgeois. And I think that also has happened in the Soviet Union. No one cares about Marxist-Leninism anymore, but everyone can appreciate Rachmaninoff. Everyone can read Chekhov, okay? That is the most significant transformation that communism did in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. That is my argument. All the other things, Cold War, Khrushchev, Solidarność, all this, that's all nice and fine. But fundamentally, there was a huge cultural shift that encompassed the entirety of society, not the majority, the entirety of it.
Yes, I agree. And especially in the second part of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, or after already during the period of Stalin, communism put aside the very progressive elements and regained also a conservative side. And this has led to the situation that the heritage of humanism was much more promoted and respected in the GDR, for example, than in West Germany.
Go ahead, George.
This is where it becomes very interesting, because John was talking about that the cultural Cold War that was sponsored by the CIA through the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And what they were promoting was modernism. That was the thing. We are modernists. We're in the West. We're modernists. They promoted modernism in art. You know, Picasso, Matisse, and things. They do old-fashioned art. We do progressive art. This is what we are about. Anyway, and therefore that modern music and everything else was always promoted by the CIA in contrast to the hidebound, very old-fashioned reactionary culture in the communist world. And that's really quite interesting that particularly during the Cold War, the communist world was indeed quite conservative. So it was in the kind of the liberal progressive West where they started making these very radical social revolutions that people at the time didn't see how radical they would be. So in the 1960s, they legalized homosexuality. People said, okay, well, that's fine. You're going to legalize homosexuality. But of course, that was, people thought at the time, well, that's going to step-by-step process that eventually will get to where we are now, where, no one blinks an eye at homosexual marriage. Same with the liberalizing divorce laws. People said, okay, well, let's liberalize divorce laws. And then we've reached the point of no-fault divorce, and therefore the disintegration of society. Same with, abortion. Okay, we'll do that in extreme circumstances. Let's legalize abortion. And then it turns out, you just have essentially, it's an abortion on demand form of contraception. So the radical social changes were taking place in the West. In contradistinction with that, in the communist world, they were actually, maintaining traditional values in the beginning, as you say. Yeah, in the early Bolshevik era, they were absolutely abortion on demand, common law marriage, everything. Now, but in the Soviet era, it was actually very difficult. Divorce was not at all easy. Abortion was not legal in the communist world. So we have the kind of social conservatism that was characteristic of the Cold War communist world, and a gradual radicalism, the radical social eventually disintegration that was in the anti-communist world.
Yeah, I think this touches the question what modernity essentially is, because we have here two kinds of modernity. One modernity that is connected to Europe, to the 19th century of Europe, the early 20th century. And then we have a kind of American California-style modernity. And those two modernities are very different. And I think the European version of modernity is a secularization of Christianity. So what has happened during the modern age was that the thought patterns of Christianity, for example, the belief in salvation during the process of history or at the end of history, the idea that everybody is equal in front of God, every soul, that the natural hierarchy of society is not the form that represents the equality of every soul in front of God, that the social understanding that comes from it, and many other aspects of Christianity, they were translated into a different vocabulary, in the vocabulary of politics, law, philosophy, and so forth. And communism and socialism and many other political philosophies of the modern age are the result of this secularization process. So if we, for example, see socialism or communism, they are political philosophy that have the history as their arena, like Christianity. They believe in a kind of cataclysmic event, like a revolution that brings the paradise. They think that the weak of the society, the workers, will be the one who organizes salvation. Like Jesus Christ also had a very weak position in the society of its time, and he turned out to be the Son of God. And these parallels were understood by the CIA, I think, in the early stage of the Cold War, because it was all published in especially in the German philosophy, in the writings of Paul Tillich, of Max Weber, of Walter Benjamin, the early school of Frankfurt. a lot of writings about these parallels of modernity. And if the CIA, I think at the time, they looked at everything. And they came to the conclusion, okay, the political philosophy we are fighting is basically a secularization of Christianity. The whole concept of modernity, in which socialism and communism and also social democrats are acting, is defined by the secularization of Christianity. Then we have to alter this frame, and we have to push modernity into a direction where it becomes anti-Christian. And we see this very much in the rise of the pop culture, the Rolling Stones, Sympathy with the Devil, and these symbols used by pop culture, rock music, they are to a large extent anti-Christian. And also the rejection of beauty, that suddenly the ugly, the provocation becomes the norm, becomes an element of progressivism, so to speak. And these California-style modernity, with this California-style value system, that was introduced into Europe to such an extent that Europe not only was pushed from its collective sense of society, be it in its conservative interpretation or in the social interpretation, was pushed to the to a liberal understanding of society, to the understanding where the individuals is in the center, and also the promotion of these new value system, which puts egoism and sexuality and also a kind of death cult to the forefront. And this new anti-Christian modernity has taken over Europe. And of course, I understand it was very difficult to see the differences between these two kinds of modernity. If we, for example, take Picasso, he's an abstract painter. He believed in communism and socialism. And if you see his famous picture about the bombing of Guernica, it's abstract, but it is still connected to the European tradition of humanism, it has not really cut itself off from history, but that is exactly what happens in postmodernity. While modernity has still the connection to history, is still comparing itself with the ancient time. This is how the term modernity was created in the comparison to the Roman Empire and the Greek period. Modernity still has this comparison, this relationship to the past, to history, but postmodernity is an attempt to cut it off, to ignore everything that is in the past, and basically to count history again with the arrival of the GIs on the European continent. With this new value system that was imported from California. And
Could I ask you about something which I don't believe you deal with in your book, and that is the hatred not only of Russia, but more specifically of Vladimir Putin, because I think Putinophobia is a very remarkable phenomenon. We had, I was chatting to Steve Jermy, who's been on our show a couple of times, and he was on with Tucker Carlson last week, and he told Tucker Carlson that a former chief of the defense staff of the United Kingdom had, when he was asked, should we speak to Russia, he said, yes, we should speak to Russia, but not to Vladimir Putin. And that remark seemed to me, apart from its stupidity, to embody this very extreme hostility to the man. How do you read that, Hauke Ritz? How do you read the hostility to him in particular?
Because there was, in the year 2000, The Atlantic had a cover page, with the title, Russia is Finished.
That's
and
right.
If you look at Russia at that time...
I know the author. I've reminded him of it many times. Okay.
If you...
Well, it's a periodical.
And I even can understand
every 6 months, doesn't it?
Yeah. I even can understand the impression the author had at the time, because if you look at Russia as it was at that time, you really could think that Russia is maybe finished, that it has become a kind of...
The same author was promoting Pussy Riot. later.
Okay. I didn't know him that well, but there was the real chance that Russia could become a new Latin America, where you drug cartels and oligarchs and criminality is influencing politics, and there where every chance to recreate society, to promote a sovereign policy would be gone, maybe forever. And I think in this moment, the personality of Vladimir Putin was very decisive. And for Russia, he was really the right man at the right place in the right moment. And maybe nobody else would be able to do what he has done at that time. And also, not he only had the experience from St. Petersburg to deal with these criminal gangs, and his experience from his own past in the Secret Service, but also he had the intellect to understand the philosophical dimension of politics and the direction in which he should guide Russia over a longer period of time. And I think the elites of the West think that this specific person has caused their defeat in conquering Russia.
Or it could be even simpler. He's an exemplar of a man.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. There is a sexual element in this. Europe is effeminate. It has a effeminate ethic. So peace, I mean, not peace anymore now, but until a few years ago, peace, consensus, horizontality, everything is done in committee. There is no decision making. There's no sovereignty. There are whole schools of political science which explain that we don't have any sovereign decision making processes anywhere in Europe, and everything counterbalances everything else. And he, of course, is the exact opposite of that. He is vertical, authoritarian. He decides everything, and so on. And I think I've said this many times. I think there's an unspoken sexual element also in the. That's why I was asking you about him. Of course, it's right that he's the man who has picked up, like Napoleon, found the crown of Russia in the gutter and picked it up with his sword. But I think there are also deeper psychological elements to this, personally.
This may be true. My thoughts, I haven't thought about it yet, but this is maybe the case. And I think that the American interpretation of European culture is internally weak because it's artificial. And the very fact that there is in the east of Europe a relatively strong country with nuclear weapons and a long, deep historical understanding of itself, who just reject this California value system is a danger for the cultural power of the Western world, because they cannot cope with comparison. And we already have seen that these comparisons had some influence on countries like Hungary and Slovakia and large parts of Eastern Europe, even to East Germany. And so I think the aim of the West, of the Western powers, or the United States in particular, is to put down the fire early enough so that it doesn't influence the whole of Europe.
And well, we see that obviously in the endless attacks on conservatives as Russian fifth columnists. That's an obvious, every dissident voice in Europe is a Russian fifth columnist. George, go ahead.
I want to ask Hauke, because you just to go back to something you started with, you talked about the division of Germany. And this is really quite striking, that somehow that the DDR, that eastern part of Germany, there seems to be fond feelings towards Russia. So you would have, after all, anyone who'd been reading all the anti-communist literature over the years would think, well, surely they must absolutely hate the Russians. They must have terrible memories of the DDR. And yet they have very good feelings towards Russia. That is the stronghold of the AfD. So I just wonder whether you could explain, why is it that here there is this warm feelings towards Russia that is absent in Poland, it's absent in Romania, and absent in a number of East European countries. How do you explain the fact that there is this warm feeling towards Russia?
I think Russophobia has a long tradition in Poland, and the Polish identity has its specifics. There's a kind of minority complex in Poland that contributes to this hatred towards Russia. When it comes to Germany, on the other side, was not really affected for Russophobia during the 18th and 19th century. We had a kind of alliance with Russia, not, of course, in many small European countries and kingdoms we had at the time. Many of them had diplomatic relationship with Russia, sometimes even kind of defense alliances. 100,000 of Germans resettled in Russia. German scientists made up large parts of the Academy of Science in Russia. Nearly every Russian government at the 18th and 19th century, there are German politicians as ministers. Even one time we had a German Tsar in Russia with Catherine the Great. So the connection between Germany and Russia were for 2 centuries so strong that it was not even imaginable that we would have a war towards each other. And if I now travel to Russia, even now, German culture is in Russia much more respected than in Germany itself. And so there is still a lot of features in the language, a lot of German words in the Russian language. The reason why Russia promoted the reunification of Germany was because of these 200 years of deep contacts between Germany and Russia. And they thought, okay, this National Socialism was the exception. We still remember the modernization we received from Germany. We want to pick up there and start to rebuild the islands once again. And the result is that Russophobia in Germany, of course, we have now for 20, 30 years, we have this anti-Russian propaganda in Germany. But it is astonishing that till today, only a small part of the society is really buying it. Of course, more West Germans than East Germans, more parts of the elites than parts of the normal society. But still recently, I have polls have shown that something like 60-70% of Germans even today wish better relation to Russia. And the anti-Russian hatred in our media is not representing the attitude in the society. And when it comes to Eastern Germany, this is even stronger. I think if the Russian army would enter Eastern Germany once again, the people would standing partly with flowers at the street and would feel liberated again.
Don't give them any ideas.
Yeah, because
could there also be another aspect to it, which is that somehow the DDR retained something of the old Germany, something that the old Germany actually was much more manifest in the DDR than the West Germany. West Germany just became completely denationalized, deracinated, didn't really resemble any kind of a country at all, whereas the DDR still maintained some of that German characteristic, the sort of the German traditionalism.
This is a very important part, and it has to do that the analysis how fascism arose in Germany was quite different between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States, already during the First World War, when Germany was not more imperialistic than France and Britain at that time, during the First World War, there came up the narrative in the United States and in Britain that somehow Hegel is at the core of German imperialism, despite the fact that Hegel was not very respected at that time in Germany itself. And 3 books from Santayana, Thorstein Veblen, and John Dewey appeared during the First World War that tried to portray German philosophy and especially Hegel as a kind of enemy of the world. And this analysis was recycled during the Second World War, and it was expanded so that German Romanticism and other aspects of German history of ideas were also brought into this context. And so the Americans arrived with the feeling after the Second World War in Germany, that German culture is fundamentally false, that it has to be recorrected, and every German has to be re-educated. While the Russians arrived in Germany with the saying of Stalin, the Hitlers come and go, the German people stay. And they had a very positive understanding of German culture, which they were in contact with for 300 years and more. And the first things the Soviet Union was doing in East Germany or in Berlin was to organize a theater of Nathan der Weise, Nathan
the Wise,
the Wise from Lessing. And the Soviet Union showed his respect to German literature, to the German classics. And so the attitude was totally different. So the Soviet Union didn't try to change German culture. They tried to promote German culture, the classical understanding of German culture, but put an emphasis on denazification, of putting some of the criminal Nazis to prison, and made sure that the Nazis don't had a kind of position in the government and some institution. While in West Germany, we have people who were involved in the Holocaust, who designed the concentration camps and still had a position in the government, in ministries and courts. And so for the first 20 years to 30 years, till the Nazis became too old, a lot of Nazis were in high position in West Germany. And of course, this had an effect on the cultural development of East and West Germany. So the West Germans, on the one side, they kept the tradition of the personalities were still in power. On the other side, they were taught in a way that their whole culture was guilty, not only this time of National Socialism, but even dating back to the 19th century, to the 18th century. And this has caused a new identity among West Germans, that a lot of West Germans don't like to hear that they are Germans. They try to identify with this international American-style culture. And they have enlarged this attitude to large parts of Europe due to the large influence Germany has within the European Union, while the East Germans still feel the connection to the traditional culture. And in this regard, also the AfD is divided. So we have the West German AfD, which try to correct something, but they still want to have the alliance with the conservative parties in the United States, with the Trump government and so forth. They will try to keep the transatlantic orientation, while the AfD in East Germany is much more radical and is really striving for sovereignty, correcting some of the American influences.
Why is that radical? Why is that radical?
It's not really radical, but they are.
I'm being facetious. I'm sorry.
But so the West Germans have, over 70 years, they have, or 80 years, they have received this re-education program. And the same kind of cultural re-education was introduced to East Germany within 30 years. And so it was far too fast and too quick to be accepted. And so a lot of East Germans rejected it. And also during the reunification, it was not really a reunification. East Germany was taken over by West Germany, and all leading positions were filled with West German. Till today, there was maybe a handful of academics in East Germany who were able to gain a chair as a professor at the university. You can count them on one hand. The rest were West Germans. And so a lot of East Germans feel till today alienated by it. They feel that this is not their country, that they are suppressed. And that's why they have the tendency to believe nothing the media are telling them. And
could I ask you?
This of course leads to the fact that a lot of East Germans look Russia Today or turn everything around.
You've outlined the role of the CIA, and that's a matter of public knowledge. But we also know, and that's also a matter of public knowledge, that the Frankfurt School, which you've referred to once or twice already, was used by the CIA and may, if in a sense, have been at the origin of this program of cultural deracination, this Charakterwäsche, as it was called at one point by another author, this washing of this brainwashing or character washing. That Frankfurt School, as the name suggests, was, of course, populated by Germans, German Jews largely, but Germans. So you are, Hauke Ritz, you are portraying this program of cultural re-education as American and Californian and so on, but it also has an autochthonous European origin, German.
So as somebody who has studied at the students of Adorno partly, I have a little bit different view of it, because you can use Adorno's writing today to criticize everything we see today. And he had its own conflict with the students of 1968. He was, they provoked him over and over again. They went into its institute. He found himself in a court, in a lawsuit against them. So, and finally he got a heart attack from it. So I think, yes, there of course, this transformation of the School of Frankfurt to the United States was a process where you have to speak with secret services. It was not possible doing without it. And the person who did it was Max Horkheimer. He was in charge for the hard work, organizing the money, speaking to the authorities. And Adorno was this very brilliant genie with an unbelievable amount of music and literature in his head. And he couldn't be fully controlled by secret services, because his understanding of language, of thoughts, of Hegel, of philosophy was too original. And he was already finished when he came to the United States. He was already who he was. So he couldn't be influenced from the beginning, as it was maybe the case by some of the French philosophers, who, which became famous in the 1970s and the 80s. And so I think that, yes, there was a partly influence on the School of Frankfurt, and I can identify it. It was that if you read the writings of Adorno and others, they always criticize the West to some extent, but then they say in the Soviet Union it's more bad. And the Soviet Union is not real communism, is not real emancipation. So in this regard, they were influenced. They were also partly influenced by promoting the thesis of totalitarianism, so saying that maybe it's National Socialism and these regimes in the East have some similarities. But, and here I have to say but, because if you read Adorno carefully, he sees the origins of fascism not in socialism, but in liberalism. And he never really has changed this idea. And then you have to look at the main book of Adorno and Horkheimer, where they lay out their theory. This is the dialectic of enlightenment. And this book is very interesting because it has two evils are in this book. The one evil is the Third Reich, and the other evil is the cultural industry of California. And they were treated equally. They as two kinds of fascism. And being a refugee in the United States in writing such a book is quite courageous.
Yeah.
And so I think, especially when it comes to Adorno and comes to Walter Benjamin, which not even made it in the United States because he died earlier. So I think the philosophical foundation can be criticized partly today. I also would criticize, for example, Adorno's promotion of abstract art. I think he himself would criticize it today if he would be alive. But still, there is so much rich thoughts in Adorno writing which can be used today.
It confirms what John is saying, because that championing of modernism absolutely coincided with the CIA's championing of modernism. That was it. That was that whole thing. Modernism. I mean, they gave it a whole philosophical spin. It's about liberation.
No. I have a different opinion in this, because if you the type of modernism that is promoted by Adorno is still secularization of Christianity. It's still the European modernism, while these anti-Christian modernism, which we see emerging in the United States, is hated by Adorno.
No, I disagree. The CIA was promoting Picasso, Matisse, Schoenberg, and that was part of that whole Congress for Cultural Freedom. They were organizing these art exhibitions and concerts. That was all to say, this is our Western culture, and we are very different from the socialist realism of the communist world. So in that sense,
in that sense, but we also have to distinguish the early rise of abstract culture had some kind of legitimacy, because you are confronted with the First World War, which was a violent act of barbarism. And of course, you cannot paint after this war in the same way you have done before with Impressionism. So there was a natural tendency that art reacted to these violent 20th century, and they became abstract. But as I have said before, I think the abstractism of Picasso, for example, is still aligned with the secularization of Christianity, is still referring to the past. Only after the Second World War, suddenly we see this promotion of abstract expressionism promoted by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and they created a kind of eternal avant-garde. In the years before, the avant-gardes were constantly changing, constantly challenging each other. And there was already a tendency going away from abstractism. And then the CIA stepped in and created this eternal avant-garde of abstract expressionism, which is in force still today. And I think the very influential philosophical background of this change was created in France in the 1960s and 70s and 80s with the rise of philosophers like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jacques Derrida. The idea that European culture has to be deconstructed totally and reconstructed after this, and that all kinds of hierarchy of references to the past have to be questioned, that fascism is everywhere. Also the idea that history of philosophy is somehow evil, because there was a fear in the CIA that if you think philosophical about history, you always end up with some utopia like socialism, communism, and also the rejection of dialectic. So I think there I would look for the philosophical sources. Of course, there is some influence in the School of Frankfurt, but they are ambivalent. They are not clear.
Could I ask you about contemporary matters? You said earlier the AfD was split, and I think we know that it's been split on all kinds of issues for a long time. But I've detected, or I believe I've detected in recent weeks, or perhaps months, something of a shift. Speeches by Alice Weidel. I was in St. Petersburg when, what's his name? Is it Markus Frohnmayer? I believe he's a regional AfD person, went to see the head of Gazprom. I believe I've detected a shift, a more open, because Alice Weidel, of course, started off being close to Trump, as you said, and Elon Musk and so on. Am I reading it correctly? Would you say that there is a mood swing now, at least within the AfD, if not within Germany at large?
Maybe my impression, I have no deep insight into the AfD, but I think maybe the fight is still undecided. I would put it this way. Maybe a half a year ago, we had the impression that the West German part was dominant, that Alice Weidel was pushing the AfD towards a transatlantic orientation, that some people in the AfD who had connection to Russia, who were traveling to Russia, came under pressure, sometimes even left the AfD, lost their position there. Now, maybe the pendulum swings a little bit back due to the result of the Iran war, where the world has shown that the United States are losing their authority in international relations. And so there maybe have rise the understanding we need at least to have a neutral position between East and West. But I still I think I hope that Alice Weidel will not become the candidate for chancellor for the AfD. Currently, it looks like she will, but I think she has this Western orientation, and she comes from the banking sector. So maybe she has, due to her work, connection to the financial understanding of American capitalism. I would prefer, or I hope that somebody from the eastern part of Germany would gain more influence in the AfD, and at least organize a neutral position that the AfD can say we are looking in both directions, to the east and to the west. More is currently, I think, not possible, and there is a fear that Alice Weidel will become a second Meloni. That she has a radical, she make radical speeches in the Bundestag currently, like Meloni did in the past. But we fear that when she comes to power, she will forget everything and just keeps the system alive with some minor adjustment when it comes to gender studies and so forth.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that in France in the Rassemblement National, which has, on foreign policy, has completely fallen into line. Peter, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting when you're talking about how Germans thought about Russians over the last decades and last centuries. I can tell you, up until the Ukraine war, I've been here for a very long time, and I've never heard Russians say anything bad about Germans at all. But now they do, because of the very forceful German support of Ukraine and the type of Ukrainians, the Banderites and stuff like that, that really grades on people a lot. Okay.
Yes.
Because, I guess we've misjudged these Germans. We thought we had understood them. And so the rhetoric that comes out of Berlin against Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine is so alienating here, because, like I said, I mean, I came to Russia during the 1990s, the worst of the worst times, and no one blamed the Germans for it. Okay, I mean, they didn't blame their history, and German technology, German culture. I mean, in the center of Moscow, there's philharmonics, everything. It's all German music. It's everywhere, okay? There's so much respect for it, revered, okay? But it's beginning to change. And I really find that very disheartening, because over Ukraine, of all things, okay? So, as a German yourself, the power, the attraction of German culture is very real, but politics can erode it.
Yes, and I just gave recently a speech at the 85th anniversary of the attack of Nazi Germany towards the Soviet Union, and I spoke about the atrocities the German army committed in the Soviet Union. And given this background, it is really astonishing the trust the Soviet Union under Gorbachev had towards Germany, granting the reunification. The French didn't want a unified Germany, the British also not. The Americans were willing to go in this direction, but only if this united Germany stays into NATO and stays under American protection and influence. And so finally it was the Soviet Union who gave in to the American demands, and so in this way organized the German unification. And and how do we thank Russia for this? By helping to divide with the United States and other German European countries, to divide the Russian realm of culture, because Ukraine is an internal part of the Russian world, and we try to pull off away Ukraine from Russia, and so we try to divide Russia as an answer to the gift of unification. It's a tragedy, and it's haunting me every day. And of course, Germany is not very loved in Europe. The French are very skeptical towards us, the Polish as well, the British as well. The Italians respect us, but they also don't love us. So the only country in Europe that had positive relations, positive feelings towards Germany was Russia. And this friend is now alienated by politicians who may have German last names, but they are not acting in the interest of the German people. They are not really influenced by our history of ideas. They are basically making their career with transatlantic organization like the Atlantic Bridge. The Atlantic Bridge.
It should be pointed out real quick here. Sorry, George. Is that John was mentioning the Vladimir Putin as a person and a persona. But when he came to power, he was overwhelmingly pro-German. I mean, Germany was, that was his bridge. I mean, if I can make it with the Germans, I can make it with the West. And he put a lot of capital into that, an enormous amount of capital.
Yes. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a very hard question to answer. There's not much time left. But you know what? In the 2+4 treaties signed September the 12th, 1990, it says there, henceforth, only peace will emanate from German soil. Helmut Kohl said that on October the 3rd, 1990, on the day of the reunification. Was that a lie?
It was a lie from when you look at at politics. Yes, I think large parts of the German society still feel this way. So the hatred towards Russia is much weaker in Germany than it is, for example, in the United States or in Poland. But our government has been captured. Like in Ukraine, our institution have been captured. It's no possibility for a professor at the university to analyze the things we are speaking today about. The same comes to our media, to our newspapers, not to speak about our party system. So Germany has been captured, and we are not able to free ourselves from it, like so many other countries on the European continent. And I think the only chance we have is the downfall, the demise of the American empire, which we see to emerge in the Middle East, where these processes, due to the Iran war, have reached a point of development that is currently not thinkable for Europe. But I think if we see the unraveling of the American empire, a vacuum will occur where suddenly these questions can be raised, these topics can be discussed. And if this really happens, it would be like a second Enlightenment. The first Enlightenment questioned the ideological use of Christianity and the power of the aristocracy. And the new Enlightenment has to question the techniques of media influence and also these transatlantic networks and how the elite system works, how they are chosen, and also it's connected to things like Epstein and compromat that is organized for high-level politicians and so forth.
Yeah,
John, I think we have a topic for to discuss when we have our guest on again. That's brilliant.
Yes. How to have a new Enlightenment and how to dismantle the American empire. Absolutely, it's a great prospect on which to end. I just want to remind our viewers that about a year ago we had a compatriot or semi-compatriot of yours, Hauke Ritz, Ulrike Reisner from Vienna. Together with Edouard Husson, an old friend of mine, a French professor of history. Together they published a book whose title at least seems to go very much with what you're saying. I've forgotten the exact title, but it's something like Europa entkolonisieren, so to decolonize Europe. And their argument is that East Germany was decolonized when the Soviets withdrew in 1990, but West Germany was not. So it's a very similar argument, and maybe we should get the three of you, or you at least, and Ulrike Reisner on a future occasion to compare notes on this subject. Hauke Ritz, thank you so much for your time. We've greatly enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure our viewers have as well. And we look forward to having you on again if you have time for us again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Laughland, for the invitation. Thank you very much, Mr. Lavelle and Mr. Samuelu.
Very good. Thanks to everyone. Goodbye, and see you in 3 weeks' time, because we're going to take a 2-week break.
Right.